Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Voluptuous Life, a tribute to the life and work of Mel Gordon. This is a special edition of City Lights Live, the virtual expression of the City Lights events calendar. I am your host, Peter Maravelis, and today's program is being brought to you by City Lights in conjunction with our friends at Morbid Anatomy and Strange Attractor Press. We will be celebrating a truly exceptional scholar, educator, dramaturg, producer, and author of numerous wonderful books. Before we begin, as is customary, I would like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people, aka the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Mel Gordon was beloved by a great many people, as today's program can attest. His erudition, humor, insatiable curiosity, enthusiasm, and generosity were qualities that brought a great many of us into his orbit. We hope with today's program to offer a kind of a toast in his memory and share some of our experiences of friendship and collaboration over the years. This is also a celebration of the publication of what is to be perhaps his final book, Cabarets of Death, Dance, and Dining in Early 20th Century Paris. It has been published by Strange Attractor Press and was edited by Joanna Ebenstein. It is a meditation on three idiosyncratically macabre cabaret restaurants in the Monmartre district of Paris, which existed from the late 1800s through to the middle of the 20th century. They were known for their grotesque portrayal of the afterworlds of heaven, hell, and nothingness. As novel as the subject of this book may appear, it is typical of the kind of material that Mel would explore. He was ever curious about the underappreciated, the underrepresented, and those seminal subject matters that oftentimes would escape public scrutiny. And he was very much into connecting the dots, I guess you could say, in regards to historic developments in theater and the avant-garde. He was fascinated by forgotten or repressed sources, and he had a gift for tracking down the unusual, the unique, and the impossibly difficult to find. We'll be making reference to this throughout our program. So joining us today are going to be Joanna Ebenstein, Maer Ben-Yisreal, Russell Blackwood, Citron, Jim Hoberman, Allison Lovejoy, La Pustra. Mark Pilkington, sadly, is not going to be with us today, but he sends his regards. We're also going to have Jill Tracy and Christina Ward. Each of our guests has their own unique portrait of Mel to share with you. We will be exploring the myriad dimensions of a man many of us had come to love and respect. So, who is Mel Gordon? Well, he was born on February the 18th, 1947 in Detroit, Michigan. His father, Joseph, was a salesman, and his mother, Rose, was an interviewer for a market research firm. His parents shared politically left-leaning politics. Mel suggested that these factors inspired his free thinking and curiosity. He graduated from the University of Michigan with a bachelor's degree, later earning a master's at NYU and a PhD in performance studies. He served as an associate editor at the Drama Review throughout the 70s, while he taught at the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute, the Michael Chekhov Acting Studio, and at NYU. Early in his career, Mel established himself as a world authority on Stanislavski and acting theory with his book, The Stanislavski Method. He finally made his home in the Department of Dramatic Art and Dance at the University of California at Berkeley, where he was known for his lively and very provocative undergraduate teaching, which included theater history, playwriting, acting, and a very popular course on bad acting, if you can believe that. He also taught about less studied theater traditions in circus and also in Yiddish theater. He has produced numerous scholarly articles on a range of subjects, including acting theory, German expressionist acting, Weimar period culture, Yiddish theater, and much, much more. His published works include Voluptuous Panic, The Erotic World of Weimar Berlin, Horizontal Collaboration, The Erotic World of Paris, Siegel and Schuster's Funny Man, the first Jewish Superman, The 7 Addictions and 5 Careers of Anita Berber, Dada Performance, and Eric Jan Hanneson, Hitler's Jewish Clairvoyant. But Mel's interest didn't end with teaching and writing. In the 90s, he created the Museum of Sexology here in San Francisco, based on Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's Weimar period Sex Institute. This was a complex and well-curated performance space, complete with erotic meals served to the public. Mel also staged shows in honor of such figures as the Weimar period chanteuse and provocateur Anita Berber. And this featured the German rock star Nina Hagen and had a run at Bimbo's over on Columbus Avenue here in the city. Mel also produced a show about Hitler's Jewish clairvoyant there as well. So, known as one of the great scholars of the Grand Guignol, he didn't stop there. He collaborated with the notorious Thrill Peddlers theatrical troupe here in the city on numerous performances. So, as you can see, Mel had a lot going on. He was also an avid collector of rare memorabilia dating back to the Weimar period and even earlier. His home was a kind of a museum and library that would act as a fertile ground for his scholarship and his passions. His papers are currently housed at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. You will learn about Mel with more intimate and personal accounts as the program progresses. To open our proceedings today, I would like to welcome the co-organizer of this event, the editor of Cabarets of Death, Joanna Ebenstein. Joanna is a Brooklyn-based artist, writer, curator, photographer, and graphic artist. She is the creator of the Morbid Anatomy blog, library, and event series, and co-founded the Morbid Anatomy Museum. Welcome, Joanna. Let me see if I can get you
spotlighted.
Let's see where you are. There you are.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that introduction. And it's a real joy and an honor to be here. Peter and I have been talking about doing this, my goodness, for a year now or something like this. This thing we've been wanting to do for a long time. And I think we met at Mel's funeral, and this has been a conversation we've had ever since. And so, yes, I was lucky enough to be the editor of Mel's, I hope the first of his posthumous works. That's my dream. He and I were working on this book when he died unexpectedly. As many of you know, he died unexpectedly. And luckily, when I reached out to Maer, Ben-Yisreal, he gave us his stamp of approval to continue with the project. I'd already been working with my friend Mark Pilkington of Strange Attractor Press and Mel on this book. And all I had to go on at that point was a PowerPoint presentation and a little bit of writings. And Maer was so kind and went through the archives, found images, rescanned things. This was very much a group effort. And I think we all had this dream of trying to bring not just Mel's final work to the public, but I think for me and maybe for all of us, I don't know if I speak for all of us, but bringing Mel's voice to a generation maybe that hadn't known him yet. I learned about Mel through my local public library. This is a big thumbs up for local libraries. I found his Grand Guignol book there. And as a young, I think I must have been in early college at that point. If any of you have seen Mel's books, they were really unique in that they were, on the one hand, very rigorous scholarship, but on the other hand, applied to topics that most people would consider questionable, if not outright something you should avoid altogether. And they were also incredibly visually rich. And as someone who was always interested in art, it seems to me that Mel understood the importance of material culture when talking about something. So not only did he make, in his writings, make history accessible and fun and sexy, we should add, dealing with topics that nobody else would touch, but he also made them visually rich. And I think seeing that kind of work definitely opened my eyes to what scholarship could be, what historianship could be, what sort of things you might create in the world that would again have both rigor and a sense of fun and warmth. So I met Mel because in around 2010, I opened my first event space. So I've been doing this project called Morbid Anatomy. We got our first physical space, and I had a huge academic crush on Mel. And so I tracked him down and I emailed him. And within an hour, we were on the phone. And within an hour, he was already planning to come to New York and do the first of what became many events at Morbid Anatomy, often with cocktails he would make or other sorts of theatrical flourishes. I hear laughter because we know this is he didn't do anything by half, right? And his events were always something to look forward to. Usually they happened around Valentine's Day. They had erotic themes. But what I wanted to do is read just a little bit from my foreword to the book, because I think it kind of sums up a bit about what made Mel special. And I think from hearing all of these things, you in the audience who have maybe not had the honor to have met Mel when he was still alive will get a sense of who he was as a man, I think hearing what you read, Peter, was so amazing, but something is missing too, because there's something about Mel that's really hard to put into words. I think that final video captures, which is a kind of a trickster, mischievous quality that was behind all of this, and yet never undermined the integrity of the scholarship. He was very much both and I've never seen anyone do that before. I don't know if any of you on the panel are familiar with anyone else who's done it in quite that way. So I hope what I read here and hearing all of us reminisce about Mel will help you know him better. And I think he was such a special person, and I know we all miss him a lot. As I said, this is just an abridged version of my forward to the book, to Cabarets of Death. So I met Mel in 2010 when I invited him to give a lecture at my newly established Morbid Anatomy event space. This encounter quickly led to a series of collaborations. Over time, Mel became a friend, a colleague, and a beloved mentor. He was always delighted by Morbid Anatomy, which he would laughingly say, usually over a cocktail, thumbed its nose at mortality, and he would do the little nose thumb. He just got a kick out of it. And it seemed to me that Mel always was laughing at death in a way. He refused to live small. He worked hard, publishing 8 books and leaving several, including Cabarets of Death, unfinished at his own death. He also played hard. When I asked him once how he managed to be so prolific, he replied, "I only let myself smoke when I write." Whether this is true or not, I have no idea, but that was his answer. If you visited his Port Richmond home, as Peter alluded to, it doubled as a museum and research library, stuffed full of books, posters, and ephemera, which he accessed via a unique, to me at least, and painstakingly organized system of notation on these little cards. It was incredible. Upon arrival, you might, as I was, be greeted with an aphrodisiac drink, a relic from his theatrical production of Dr. Magnus Hirschfield's Museum of Sexology. As he explained to me, the production, for a variety of complicated reasons, ended prematurely, leaving Mel on the line for thousands of dollars. This, he told me with a mischievous smile, was why he started writing books in the first place. It was a way he could repackage all the rare material culture he had collected for the production and pay back his creditors, and he was very proud of having done that in a very short period of time. For all the surface glibness of Mel's work, it is serious stuff, based on deep original research, following his own particular methodology and his social science training. His rule, which I am told he taught to his students as well, and that this was not necessarily popular to teach, was that one needed to disregard all received knowledge and go back to the sources, read contemporary newspaper and magazine articles, look at the material culture related to the topic, and if possible, find and interview people who had been involved with these scenes. He tirelessly scoured eBay shops and private collections in search of artifacts which everyone but he was certain had been irrevocably lost. He seemed to be blessed with a preternatural serendipity in this department, somehow unearthing things you could not imagine could be found, much less still exist, including Soviet constructivist productions from the 19-teens, Anita Berber Berlin cabaret dances from the 1920s, and he would show these casually at a lecture in this tiny room with 40 chairs, like a magician pulling back a curtain during his many unforgettable lectures. And I should say, this didn't make the cut of the forward, but during one of these unforgettable lectures, which had to do with his book, which I hope someone will finish, he was working on at his death, about California love cults. I was sitting with a very distinguished museum director, and after the end of the lecture, he turned to me with a giant grin on his face, and he said, "I don't know if a word of that was true, but it was amazing." And that's kind of how you felt after a Mel lecture. They were like theatrical productions. They were not just lectures. Mel was also very funny, charming, witty, and the best storyteller that I have personally ever met. And he had a gift for weaving together research and imagery into dazzling productions that enthralled, amazed, inspired, and delighted, while at the same time imparting knowledge. I imagine today that Mel Gordon is laughing at death. Of all the people I knew, he is the one who had, or so I would hazard from what I knew about him and the stories I heard at his funeral, the fewest regrets about a life unlived on his deathbed. I'd like to imagine that somewhere Mel is watching us still here on Earth and getting a kick out of it all, out of the absurdity of his laudatory obituary in the New York Times, and the fact that parts of his collection made their way into very prestigious academic research libraries. I also hope it would delight him to know that this book came to be, so that we could continue and engage with his warm, brilliant, and fun work about life, sex, death, and fun from beyond the grave. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Joanna. That was lovely. So I want to remind everyone, I've posted links with which you may purchase this very, very lovely tome. So keep your eye out in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard for that, as well as other titles by Mel. So we are honored to have a member of Mel's family with us here today. Our next guest is Mel's nephew, Maer Ben-Yisreal. He is technology director at École Bilingue de Berkeley. Maer, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for everyone joining us today. My name is Maer Ben-Yisreal. I'm Mel's nephew and the representative of his estate. It's always difficult to know what to say about Mel because he was, as you'll hear or as you know, master lecturer and interlocutor. But I won't attempt to challenge that today, and I will keep it brief, just with a list of thanks. First to Joanna for bringing us the project that we didn't even know existed, and then running to the finish line. Mark Pilkington from Strange Attractor in the UK for publishing, Citron and Jim Hoberman, who are here, who were Mel's closest friends, for contributing forwards and prefaces to the book. Also want to thank Jessica Parfray and Christina Ward from Feral House as longtime collaborators, and who were in discussions with continuing some posthumous publications in the future. And finally to Peter at City Lights, who was also a good friend of Mel's and extremely supportive of his work. So thank you for hosting this. Thank you for everyone for being here, and I'll turn it over to the more interesting guests.
Thank you so much, Maer. Much appreciate you being here with us today. Let me see if I can get Russell unmuted here. I haven't seen Russell in ages, and this is such a treat.
Bless your heart, sir. Well, I have the
but
honor
before
of
you
knowing-
begin, I do want to say a couple of little things. Some of my own memories of Mel actually go back to our first meetings at the time that his book Voluptuous Panic came out. Were you in town for that at that time, Russell?
I wasn't at the release, but I was around all while he was writing it and for the release, and he did things at the Hypnodrome.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd been aware of the Museum of Sexology and was, very, very intrigued by the concept. So I approached Mel to do a launch party for Voluptuous Panic at City Lights. So it wasn't enough that we would have a simple signing. I mean, we ended up taking things to a completely different level. So we converted the basement of City Lights.
I was there.
Yes. We converted the basement of City Lights into a Weimar nightclub, complete with like semi-nude dancers walking around with cocktails, a singing chanteuse, and an installation made up of some of the Magnus Hirschfeld sex machines. And I think that the demonstration of the fucking bicycle machine made jaws drop that night. In fact, the fact that I still had a job the next day, I think, is a testament to City Lights and Ferlinghetti's tolerance. In fact, I even got into trouble at Vesuvio's when we did the Anita Berber book because Mel had his dancer shooting up in the rafters. So really, I think that kind of those two events really cemented our friendship. I think he figured, okay, if you're willing to do that, and he became a mentor, a consultant, kind of like my pastoral counselor on many crazy and wonderful projects. And he came up with the idea of building a time machine for our Carnival Pataphysique weekend, which was an Alfred Jarret tribute. He was also on our advisory board for a Dada World Fair. He shared some of his wonderful stories of time spent with Walter Mehring, who was living in New York at the time Mel was there. So, I mean, really such an excellent raconteur. And I think one of my favorite pastimes was our vodka and herring ritual as I would call it. Every few months we get together for lunch over at Saul's Jewish Deli in North Berkeley, and just engage in these rambling conversations on everything from avant-garde to burlesque theater to you name it. I mean, Mel knew how to, take apart a subject from many different angles, and this has always managed to kind of give you these amazing and really unique views. So these were really very delightful meetings that left me with some really lovely memories. And we'd often walk over to the cheese shop after the vodka and herring, where Mel would coach me on the fine nuances of smelly French cheese. So he was very, very generous with his time, his knowledge, all of that. And I really, really treasure his memory. And I think you do too, Russell. For everyone in the audience, Russell is the artistic director of Thrill Peddlers Theater, where he reigned for 20 years. I mean, almost more than 20 years, I think, right?
25 years we did
Yeah.
Grand Guignol.
Yeah, 25 years. And Grand Guignol, which was, and also Theater of the Ridiculous. You were doing musicals. You did a Coquettes musical, which was really fantastic. I remember that. So yeah, Russell has been producing really astonishing shows for those of you that have been lucky to attend. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. And that a foot pedal masturbation machine sat outside the restroom at the Hypnodrome for many years, our theater, on loan. I'm going to talk about both Thrill Peddlers and the theater that we ended up founding. Thrill Peddlers definitely began as a horror theater, specifically Grand Guignol. But the Hypnodrome, I think, took a page out of Cabarets of Death like you wouldn't believe. So I have some pictures of that as well, and many of Satan. Now, in 1988 at the BU bookstore, I was graduating from Boston University, and my childhood friend Daniel Zilber spotted this Grand Guignol book. And we'd heard from childhood, from his father who grew up in Paris, about the Grand Guignol, but there was nothing written in English about it. So here I am, graduating with a BFA in acting and Mel's book in my hands. I moved out for a job in San Francisco, and by 1991 had done an adaptation of one of the plays in the books called the Laboratory of Hallucinations. And lo and behold, Mel had accepted the job as head of the theater department at UC Berkeley simultaneously with this production going up in San Francisco. So Mel showed up to the one of the performances, and we became fast friends. In 1999, Daniel Zilber, who spotted that book with me in the bookstore, moved out to the Bay Area, and we decided that we were going to do an annual event in celebration of the Grand Guignol, but also of fetish theater and blackout spook shows. We started that in 1999, and over the course of these first a few Shocktoberfests, several international Grand Guignol historians hooked up with us as well. Agnès Piron in France, and Richard Hand and Michael Wilson in the UK, who now have written 4 books about Grand Guignol. Agnès has written, I believe, 3, including an anthology of 45, 50 of the plays. Now, of course, Mel was an extraordinary resource for us laying our hands on information about the theater. And in 2003, we launched grandguignol.com to get some of this information out on out to the public. And it was articles from men's magazines about the Grand Guignol that were one of Mel's biggest contributions to grandguignol.com. Warning on the slides now. We opened the Hypnodrome Theater in 2004. It was south of Market in San Francisco, and sat 45. The theater, as you'll see, is just covered with images of the devil. The one that you see there underneath the blade of the guillotine and other places was from a spook show poster. It's kind of a, oh gosh, a monocled vampire skull devil with a monk's tonsure and a high collar. At any rate, we had a bar that was a coffin and a life-size guillotine that the audience actually got into after some of the performances. Next slide. The theater, as I said, sat 45, but among those were these three last row of shock boxes. And heaven and hell were the center shock boxes. The ones house left were psychiatrist's office and a padded cell. And the ones house right were the Pharaoh's tomb. There underneath the booth house right was also another seating option called the Turkish Lounge. And then if you look very far down in front of the front row, just about center, you'll see a brown box with a handle. Well, that's a coffin that would actually slide out from underneath the audience and into the space. Now, the shock boxes were rigged for our blackout spook shows, which were always the finale of one of our Shocktoberfest performances. Next slide. And here was our stage. Actors would move around in complete darkness. We would black out the emergency lights, and they would have glow-in-the-dark props that would fly over the heads of audience members and do all kinds of strange things in the dark. And the shock boxes were specially rigged with effects, secret doors, compressed air, vibrating seats. Mel directed and wrote two performances for the theater. One was based on Abu Ghraib with a female guard erotically torturing a prisoner, and ending with the actual video of a beheading that you might remember from those days. He did another one called Google Fetish, which was a variety act featuring the, a fart fetish act, a forced feminization act, and a ball busting act, each which was introduced with the staggering search results that you'd get on Google when you searched any of those three fetishes. They were in the millions. Next slide. This is an adaptation of a book, of a play from one of Mel's books called The System of Dr. Goudron and Professor Plume, or Professor Tar, or Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. And all four of the plays that appeared in the three editions of Mel's Grand Guignol books, we had occasion to adapt and perform. This one actually performed not only in San Francisco, but also in Rio de Janeiro with our sister company, Vigor Mortis. And we did Crime in the Madhouse, both in San Francisco and in Pretoria, South Africa. Next slide. Now, for the 14th Shocktoberfest, we did probably what was closest to the kind of interaction that you would see in the Hell restaurant and cabaret. So this was a character that was in a pre-show entertainment who would play the Victrola, and the audience would come in to a hypnodrome they didn't quite recognize at half hour because it was very, very dark with ambient sound playing. This actor involved in his own business, and then an actor upstage who was making up into a mirror, and you were just seeing his reflection. Over the course of the half hour that the audience was coming in, this ambient sound gets louder and louder. And next slide. And this strange character starts cutting. You also realize that the actor making up in the mirror is actually doing himself up as Satan. Next slide. And here he is. So as part of the half-hour entertainment, some of the mad people from Dr. Tar and Professor Feather would go around and ask audience members to write their biggest fear on a little slip of paper and drop it in a hat. And so after we performed the first play, Satan came out again, and I would one by one announce each of these fears in a hat for the audience. And Satan would lip sync to his exclamations after each of the audience members' fears. Next slide. This is my husband, Jim, who was the bartender and frequent actor. In fact, I was an actor there too, and Mel would often call Jim the second best actor at the Hypnodrome. In the background also is my father, who was the designer of all of our scenery and the decor there. And I just love the wistful way both of them are looking off into space. Next slide. So Peter mentioned that we worked with members of the Coquettes, and to Mel's right is Scrumbly Coldwin, who was the composer of the Coquettes' music. And he wrote not only the revivals of the Coquette shows that we did there, but 2 shows that were in part based on Mel's books. This one, The Untamed Stage, took its cue from Voluptuous Panic, and even included, The Wild Boys and Shoe Whores. If you've read the book, you know what they are. We also did a piece called Jewels of Paris, which used horizontal collaboration as one of its jumping off points. So it was a real pleasure to have Mel there taking a bow with us at the end of the performance that he saw. In the dedication of Mel's first and second edition of Grand Guignol, Theater of Fear and Terror, he dedicated it to a mentor of his who had just recently directed the inaugural productions of The Phantom of the Opera and Sweeney Todd. And it read, "The Howell Prince, the newest bandit of the Grand Guignol." Well, his third edition from Farrell House, he gave me a very great gift. Final slide. He dedicated it to me as the newest bandit. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much, guys, for being here.
Thank you so much, Russell. That was really lovely. And thanks for sharing those photos too. It was really fantastic. Well, our next guest is a dear friend of Mel's. Please welcome Associate Professor of Theater and the University of Haifa in Israel, Ari Citron.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I would like just to say that Mel was the first person to welcome me in New York in January of 1980 when I arrived there for my graduate studies. And since then, we remained very close friends in New York City, later in the Bay Area, visits to Israel, back in the Bay Area, and so on and so forth. First, we were friends. Then he asked me to be his teaching assistant. Then we taught a course together on Jewish performance, which led eventually to my dissertation. In the meantime, he defended his dissertation and got his PhD. So it went on and on through several wives, many cats, a few of my dogs. And I would also like to read 3 short segments from the foreword I wrote and to explain why I wrote it this way. As you'll hear in a minute, Mel told me about the book just in our last conversation, the last conversation we had in Berkeley, when he already predicted his own death. He said, "I have 2 years to live." He was almost precise. But I was so excited by that I didn't ask any questions. I just wanted to hear more. And later, when I had the questions, he was no longer there to answer them. So as if in a seance, I heard him say, "Why don't you try to answer your own questions? Do some research, boy." And I did. So I'm reading this. Mel Gordon, my friend in many ways my mentor, and please show the first slide. In my foreword to Mel's book, I briefly survey the history of morbid entertainment in Western civilization, especially the emergence of the Danse macabre, Totendance, Dance of Death, after the Black Plague of the 14th century. Now we can have the second slide, please. Inviting two persons to dance with him. One is a physician, one is the suitor, and they're supposed to dance with him. He sometimes just dances, and at other times he plays a drum or a flute or a fiddle. So this is from the 15th century. I will leap to the 19th century and to the symbolist movement that was enthralled with the theme of death and embraced the danse macabre. We can already see the switch to the next slide. And I will say that James Enstor, Gustav Klimt, and Edvard Munch were the most famous artists who worked with the danse macabre theme. I chose a painting by the less-known Swiss artist Arnold Böcklin, titled Self-Portrait with Death as Fiedler from 1874. In the foreground, the artist is looking at his reflection in the mirror in order to paint his self-portrait. Behind him, and extremely close to his left ear, Death, the grinning skull, holding the violin bow with a skeletal hand, playing the Totendance tune. Whenever I look in the mirror, Böcklin seems to suggest, I cannot but see my loyal accompanist. The symbolists were active in the cabaret movement, and their fascination with death marked the history of cabaret. The first cabaret artistique, founded by Rodolphe Saly in November 1881 in Montmartre, was called Le Chat Noir. Now we can switch to the next slide. Le Chat Noir, the Black Cat, as an homage to Edgar Allan Poe's short horror story by the same title. The tale is a confession of a psychopath who murdered his wife with an axe and hid her corpse in the brick wall of his basement, together with a black cat that he had blinded earlier with a pocket knife. The story was translated into French by the poet Charles Baudelaire, who idolized Poe. Death, decay, ennui, alcohol, hashish, opium, and sex were prevalent in Baudelaire's own poems that were collected under the title Les Fleurs du Mal, Flowers of Evil, in 1875. That scandalous book that had the poet persecuted and fined for, quote, offense against public morals, unquote, became the inspiration for the symbolist poets Stéphane Mallarmé, Arthur Rimbaud, and Paul Verlaine, a group that was proudly carrying the name Les Poètes Maudits, the accursed poets. In the poem Langueur, 1883, which could be perceived as poetic manifesto of the decadent movement in poetry, Verlaine expressed heartache, ennui, a yearning for death, and for emptiness, or nothingness, néant in French, like the name of one of the three cabarets of death. Rimbaud's collection of prose poetry was called Une saison en enfer, a season in hell, enfer being the title of another cabaret of death. So it seems that the stage had been set for the cabarets of death about a decade or two before they were founded. The hub of the Poètes Maudits prior to the opening of the Chat Noir was a brasserie at the foot of a Montmartre hill known as Le Rat Mort, Dead Rat Café, a title reflecting the reversed aesthetics of the symbolists, that which is mal, evil, in the eyes of the bourgeoisie, repulsive and associated with filth and epidemic disease, was made spitefully attractive to them, as a joke perhaps, a meaningful joke. It was at Le Rat Mort that the drunk Rimbaud accidentally slashed the thigh of his lover Verlaine during a dangerous game with a knife. There was also the Cabaret des Assassins in Montmartre, decorated with pictures of the famous murderers of the period. And when the Montmartre spirit crossed the border to Germany, Munich's leading cabaret named itself the Elf Scharfrichter, the 11 executioners. Each of its founders created a stage name for itself that was related to death. Balthadar Stahl, which means Balthadar rigor mortis, Dionysus Tod, death, Till Blut, blood, and so on. Sarcasm, social and political critique were always part of the cabaret. But it is important to remember that what this book is about is entertainment. Death and the afterlife appear to be excellent materials for a unique kind of entertainment, the kind of which is innovative, theatrical, and sometimes also philosophical. In fact, before it opened in Paris, the Cabaret du Néant, the Cabaret of Nothingness, opened in Brussels as Cabaret Philosophique. We still die, and most of the time we still sweep the discussion of death under the carpet. A novelty of our time is Death Café, in which people are invited to talk about their own death in a relaxed atmosphere over coffee and cake. Death Café was initiated in 2004 in Switzerland with the objective of breaking the, quote, tyrannical secrecy, unquote, surrounding the topic of death. In 2011, it was active in 66 countries and as a framework for open conversations about the end of life, and had a website that formed a global Death Café virtual community. In German-speaking countries, Death Café is known as Totentanzcafé. It offers no dancing or magic tricks, however. It is an intimate social gathering focusing on verbal intercourse, somewhat like group therapy perhaps, and normally avoiding dark humor. Here I would like to ask for the last slide. But the imagery one finds in the website does remind one of the classic Totentanzcafé. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So up next is none other than Jim Hoberman. He is a film critic, journalist, author, and academic, and served as a senior film editor at the Village Voice and has written for The Guardian, the New York Times Review of Books, Film Comment, as well as the New York Times, amongst other publications. He was also a very, very dear friend of Mel's. Let me see if I can get you unmuted. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great. This has been really, has really thrown me back, I must say. There's a lot of great stuff that people have said, so evocative. So I'm just going to touch on a few things. I first met Mel 39 years ago. I was a film critic at the Village Voice, but I did other things too. And the theater editor, Erica Monk, sent me off to see something that she thought I would be interested in, which was The Masked for Evening, which was a production that Mel did based on the work of Nikolai Ferreger, an incredibly obscure participant in the Soviet avant-garde of the early 20s, and somebody whom, if I'm remembering correctly, was living in Brighton Beach, or one of his actors were. This I found out later, that Mel actually had made connection with somebody who was in these places. Anyway, it was a very delightful. I mean, they called the troupe the Marxists of Mayhem. I mean, it just was a hilarious show, and Erica was so correct in directing me to this, because I just loved it from beginning to end. Then the strangest thing, this was up at NYU where Mel was teaching. He used one of the lecture halls or something like that. Walking out, I see this very tall woman who seems familiar to me, you know, like I seen her on television or something. It was Sigourney Weaver. I mean, how did he get her to come to this performance? Who invited her? I mean, I was like completely taken aback by this. And I would have to say that Mel was, from beginning to end, a very mysterious person, as you have no doubt gathered from things that people have said. I'll just point out two things. If you stick around for the end, there's something that Mel says, which is so typical when he's talking about. Oh, I forget which book. He says there are so many funny things about it. He says, and then he goes on and he has this half smile, which you will also see in some of the other photographs. That's him. I mean, anyway, so I wrote about this piece, and then I heard from him out of the blue, not about the piece. I mean, but because he had somehow, you know, gleaned that I was interested in Yiddish theater and was writing a book on Yiddish language movies. And as you've heard, Mel was unbelievably generous with his scholarship. I mean, there's you know, so he got in touch with me. He had all these interviews that his students had done with surviving members of the RTEF, which was the Yiddish, you know, workers theater, basically a communist group in the 30s. And gosh, you know, I hope that somebody will go to the University of Texas and dig these things out. I mean, they're fascinating. And this is something else about Mel. When, you know, when he was at NYU, he was the associate editor or the assistant editor of the Drama Review. The Drama Review was never as good as when Mel was working there, because he would send people out to research, you know, like the most amazing stuff. I mean, you know, every issue had some incredibly historical piece. And you know, he directed this, but he didn't have to write it. He was like an artist who had a you know, his studio, and other people would be doing this. Anyway, that was quite amazing too. So we became very good friends. And I would say that Mel was a great friend. I mean, he was upbeat, he was supportive, he was brilliant, he was fun to hang out with. And he was also a wonderful colleague. I mean, we had a number of things, you know, in interest, you know, things in interest, our politics as well. And we were, as he would have said, we were chavarim, you know, we were comrades, you know, and we only worked on one thing together, which I think oh, if you can see this, we produced a CD from Mel's collection of Yiddish theater music, stuff that had been given. He either found some of it in the old Soviet Union, or they had been distributing these things at the 1939 World's Fair. I could never figure out how he came up with this stuff. And anyway, so my main contribution to this was pushing it to happen and coming up with the title. I mean, Mel did everything else. Maer actually remastered this, so he deserves a lot of credit for it too. Maybe there's still some copies around. I mean, goodness knows that we never sold very many of them. We called this Mensch Productions, and we were completely right, you know, that nothing ever came of it. We were also going to work on a book on bad act, because I was very interested, and I had written about this, and I think I spoke to one of his classes about bad acting, but that never happened. You know, Mel always had a million things going on. And I just want to say something about, he was not just a fantastic gleaner, and hearing about how he found the material for the Voluptuous Panic, you know, going to Germany and getting stuff off of eBay, and how he could find this stuff in flea markets there. And then he spent his money, he sold it all back and made money, because the Germans themselves hadn't been collecting, you know, seriously collecting this. He somehow come up with like the greatest archive of this Weimar stuff. I mean, so that was always fascinating. But you know, he would baffle, let's say, the more legitimate, I don't know how to say, more respectable scholars. They were I saw this with my own eyes, you know, when he was helping out at the Jewish Museum. They did a program on the Gosset and on Chagall and so on. And Mel came by, with this, this collection of stuff. The curator was flabbergasted. Like, how did he have this? I mean, they were indignant that somebody could have, discovered this stuff. So he really was a kind of underground historian, the same way that like S. Clay Wilson is like an underground cartoonist or something. I mean, he just was doing his own thing totally, and his generosity was really extraordinary in my experience. But I would say also that he was a very interesting thinker, very interesting thinker. His takes on things were always unexpected, and I thought provocative. And we used to see each other sometimes. I had family in Berkeley, so I would come out. We would see each other, but we spent a lot of time talking on the phone about various things. And I just have to say that I'm only exaggerating slightly when I say that not a day goes by when I come across something that I would have wanted to ask him about or alert him to, or just wonder about his take on something. And that's the books are there, but the man lives on in our in our memories. And that's what I have to say. Thanks for everybody for these for what they've been saying about him.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to share this issue of TDR. That's the Dada issue that was actually the inspiration for Dada World Fair. It all came out of a conversation sitting in Saul's, and Mel said, "Oh, you're into Dada, but you've got to have this." And there is just some amazing stuff in this little issue of TDR. So yes, thank you so much for that. So next up is award-winning classical pianist, composer, educator, and cabaret artist, Allison Lovejoy. She has toured extensively and produced numerous recordings. She has also created a cabaret musical stage show titled The Seven Deadly Pleasures. She's on the faculty at the Community Music Center and also Foothill College, where she teaches music theory. Allison, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thank you, Peter. And thanks everyone for your interesting and really, really sweet comments about Mel. He was such an really inspiring and generous historian and writer. And I was lucky to meet him through Peter. Actually, I was participated in the Dada World's Fair, as well as an event, a book release event for Mel's book Horizontal Collaborations. I think that was in 2015. Is that right? That's about right. And I performed some songs at the Lost Church in their old venue in the Mission. And interestingly enough, I have this side career that is very, very influenced by Weimar and Parisian cabaret, not the dancing, but the music. They're distinct here in the United States. It's a very different thing, right? So I started writing a lot of these songs about politics and sex and scandal and history, and I've been having a lot of fun developing a show called The Best Bad Things with my writing partner Candace Forrest, a composer. We started writing a show right at the same time I met Mel about Madams of San Francisco. And, we have a rich and also sordid history of bordellos and prostitution, starting with the Barbary Coast. And of course, with the shipload of French women that came in the Golden Ingot Lottery, the prostitution, the world of prostitution and bordellos was even enhanced more greatly by their charm and skill and great fashion. So the show developed, of course, beyond that, and the Best Bad Things is now a show about the body, bold, and beautiful women of San Francisco, that goes beyond madams, but also includes heroines such as Mary Ellen Pleasant and Donaldina Cameron, and several other fascinating women. But Mel actually had really a lot of information, both in his book, Horizontal Collaborations, and about San Francisco that he shared with me. And I wish I had the opportunity to get to know him better and work with him more. But both he and Gary Camilla, my friend, are expert historians and have been really wonderful and generous with their help in supporting the writing. So I'm going to perform for you one of the pieces. I have one about Sally Stanford, the great madam who continued her very, very successful work as a beloved madam into the mid 20th century, and also about Tess Wall, who was considered to be the most successful madam in the world. One of her bordellos is actually where the Hilton is now located on Union Square. She had several, and of course was destroyed in the earthquake. So I've written pieces about both of them that talk a lot about their relationship with both the city, politicians, gentlemen, ladies, and even though they were sometimes shunned by many, they were loved by many because the bordellos also served as social centers. In the anterooms, women would play music and play cards, and there was often good food there. And there were, of course, many other services offered. So I'm going to play for you a song called Excess. The title and main line are actually borrowed from Oscar Wilde's line, "Nothing succeeds like excess." But it describes very well a lot of the life of the Barbary Coast in San Francisco. I was a woman of no importance. My face was plain and my dress rather dull. I found that life to be discordant, so I vowed to do well before I grow old. I devised a way into society, but I couldn't endure the sobriety. I'll have it all. Screw propriety. The best way to success is excess. Excess is the key to success. Have you ever heard of too much sex? Moderation is a fatal thing. Within their means suffers from a lack of imagination. Pearls, furs, and ruby rings. I can't resist temptation. I'll march on like a strumpet. You'll do-do-do-do on your trumpet. Loosen that corset, and we'll take off of the rest. Now I've outdone the best of men. I own the largest house of delights. Men tip their hat to me and say, "Good day, madame." And even our governor has spent the night. My girls live in style and luxury. They save you men from your drudgery. Forget the law, I paid the judgery. The best way to success is excess. Excess is the key to success. Pour more champagne and fill my glass. Moderation is a fatal thing. This is a sing-along here. Let's try out Zoom, see if it works. I say excess, you say success. Excess, excess, success, excess, success, excess, success, excess, success. Moderation is a fatal thing. Thank you so much. I'll share the link to the Best Bad Things, our website, and some videos of more songs if in the chat if you'd like. And I'm really happy to be here. Thanks again for inviting me, Peter.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Our next guest is joining us from across the ocean. La Pustra is an actor, singer, salonier, and cabaret artist who has performed in European cabaret since 2006 and is best known as serving as the creative director for the Weimar period-inspired theater play Le Pustra's Cabaret der Namenlosen. La Pustra incorporates elements of theater, drag, and fashion in his work. It is a pleasure to have you with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Joanna for inviting me. We got to work together, I think 2021 on some lectures, or 2022, I can't remember. And we share this passion for Mel Gordon's book. So unfortunately, I never had the pleasure to meet Mel. I discovered his Voluptuous Panic book in 2010. A very dear friend of mine gave me this book and the Anita Berber biography, and then a trip to Berlin followed. And I remember we went together, and the first time I visited Berlin, which is where I'm based at the moment, I'm just in England, on my way to New York next week to join Joanna's Morbid Anatomy benefits. And I was quite disappointed when I first arrived in Berlin, because you have this idea of what it would be, and it was nothing like that at all. So I think this visit and discovering these books kind of gave me the idea to create my own Weimar era inspired show the way I would see it. And Mel's book really, it's just something about the book, how it's presented, the aesthetics in the book, the beautiful and provocative illustrations and photos. It just opened a complete new world to me, because up until that point, like many performers, I was just familiar with Marlene Dietrich or the Liza Minnelli film. So that's kind of where my knowledge ended. And upon discovering this book, a whole world opened. And then in 2015, I was planning to move to Paris, but I couldn't find an apartment. And then I have this friend who lives in Berlin, and she just said, well, just come live with me. And that's exactly what I did. So it was completely unplanned. So I found myself in Berlin, and I didn't know what to do. So this show, the Cabaret of the Nameless, which really existed from 1926, and is also mentioned in Mel's book. If you go towards the back of the book, he lists various cabarets, and there's even a map where all these locations were, which I've since all visited. And it's a bit depressing because they don't exist anymore, of course. The only known building that's intact is the very famous El Dorado in Schöneberg, which is now a Bayer supermarket. So it's really sad. But the building still exists. And when I first arrived, there was a little photo of Marlene Dietrich in the foyer when you came in. So they've since removed it. So the Cabaret, the Nameless, really existed, and I wanted to incorporate many different influences and create a show that really, I guess, captures the freedom of the Weimar era time, which the Germans don't really call it the Weimar era. It seems to be more the English and the Americans that use Weimar, but they call it the Golden 20s, which was actually mostly 1926 to 29 when the economy picked up. So I think it really helped also living in Berlin, learning the language, learning German songs, and just doing my own research, which I'm a bit envious of Mel, where he got all these wonderful illustrations and postcards and things. They're very rare to find now in Berlin. They're all hidden, or private collectors have them stashed away somewhere. But there are lots of research avenues to follow in Berlin, like the Akademie der Künste. They have many things. If you know what you're looking for, you can find it there. So I just embarked on this journey of really being in the city and learning the culture and really living that as much as I can. And I was very lucky to have a lot of cabaret friends who lived that life. And we created the show together, and the show premiered in 2016 in a pre-war building, which also is very hard to find now in Berlin, as everything was destroyed. And this little venue had 1930 telephones on the tables. We can ring, and they all had numbers, which was very annoying because in the beginning people would just call each other and laugh. But we in the end incorporated the telephones into the show. So we created this little show. The very first one, I just remember everyone was new. There were trays of cocaine everywhere. Some were baby powder. I honestly can't remember. And I just wanted to create something that was authentic and as true to the period as how I imagined it. There's unfortunately not any known footage of these cabarets that exist, or maybe they weren't recorded at the time. So I really had to use my own imagination and my own creativity to create kind of a dreamlike tableau vivant kind of concept. So I really spent the last 10 years of my life on this project, and then that led to our show being featured in the TV show Babylon Berlin, which it was a great way to, I guess, end the show. We finished the show last year at a beautiful variety theater in Berlin. So these books, and especially the Anita Berber book, and I have some photos there. If it's ready, Peter, of the show. They're all PG, so I had to just pick the ones that are the most user-friendly. So this is a photo of a Berliner performer called Bridge Markland, and she performs as Anita Berber. So she has her own interpretation. Oh, there is a nude lady at the back. Oh, I can see her. So Bridge, who's a big fan of Anita, and she has a huge archive also of Anita and all the German books. One of Anita's German biographers, Luther Fischer, who wrote many, many books on Anita Berber. And I think Mel did the only English biography as far as I know. And so it was really nice to collaborate with Bridge on this show, who brought her own interpretation of Anita Berber. She plays her much older, as Anita died quite young in 1928. And there's even now a park where she was buried. They renamed it the Anita Berber Park. It's a few years now. There's a pub called Anita Berber. So she's relatively unknown still, but she is kind of slowly being discovered more. And I even did a show in Vienna in the Bristol Hotel where Anita had many of her scandals, which also Mel writes about in his book. So yeah, so that's Bridge as Anita Berber. I think we can go into the next one. So the show just took on a life of its own. It really was a passion project, which led to many things. We had an art exhibition. We had the late Anthony Bourdain from Parts Unknown that came over and they filmed us, and the BBC. And I think at the time when I presented this show, it was still kind of, Germans don't seem to really know much about this history. I find it's more the foreigners that come to Berlin to look for that quote unquote divine decadence. Which is obviously there. I mean, Berlin is famous for its hedonism and nightlife, but I really had to create this painting come to life with everything I enjoy, and with these beautiful performers who are all cabaret artists, so that they brought real authenticity to the show. And I think that's what made it special. I think we can go on to the next one. So my character with the red hair was very based on Anita. I don't think her hair was that big though, but the color. And so I kind of morphed Marlene Dietrich's androgyny and Anita Berber's kind of brooding quality and red hair into this character, which, as I mentioned, then ended up in Babylon Berlin, which I think was a nice kind of way to document and what's the word? Immortalize the show. And yeah, always with a cigarette. Because in Berlin, you can still smoke in many, many bars, which I like. So we can move on to the next. And so that microphone, I was very, very particular about the details, as up to this point, I've done many variety shows, 1920s themed shows, and they were always bland. I was always asked, told you can't do this, you can't say that. So in this venue, in this city, we had carte blanche. We could just go for it. So that really helped. And that microphone is actually from the 1930s. So I really, really wanted to have beautiful things. We mostly had antiques and vintage costumes sourced on stage. And this venue had a gorgeous big mirror at the back, which created just beautiful imagery. So we can move on. And that's me and my gentleman friend, or the gigolo. I discovered so many beautiful German songs from the time. They're so funny, they're so silly. I really wanted to move away from the cliched songs that you would, there's no Marlene Dietrich songs in the show, I'm very happy to say. So there was the amount of material that I discovered. I think Mel would have really enjoyed these funny little songs, and I haven't even probably touched the surface yet. So we can move on. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's it. Okay. So yeah, I'm so grateful that these books exist, and I do consult them now and then. They become sort of a handbook, and Mel's writing is so theatrical and it's so visual, and I can imagine us having one of his famous cocktails and share a dirty joke or two. I'm sure he seems like someone with a really good, healthy sense of humor, which is rare these days. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for being with us. That was really lovely. So was the man with the top hat based on Fantomas?
No, he's actually based on all the war heroes that came back, and because of the economy, that they had to become taxi dancers or gigolos. So he is a gigolo I meet in my nightclub, and it turns out very bad, of course. But
of course. Thank you so much. This is lovely. Well, let's see. I'm going to get some media set up here for our next guest. See if we can get this lined up. So next up is composer, singer, pianist, storyteller, and a musical evocateur based in San Francisco. Jill Tracy's music has appeared on film and television. She has collaborated and performed with music legends such as Peter Murphy of Bauhaus, Stephen Severin of Susie and the Banshees, Ray Manzarek, Nina Hagen, amongst others. Her acclaimed short film, The Fine Art of Poisoning, won over 30 film festival awards. Jill, wonderful to see you again after many, many moons. Thank you so much for being here and celebrating Mel with us.
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much. It's so great. It's so inspiring. Like someone said earlier, it's really a walk down memory lane and reconnecting with so many people. And I just want to thank Joanna for your dedication and passion to continue to bring this project into the world, because I know Mel loved this imagery. He loved these stories, and I worked with him for several years, but the few years before his death, as he was acquiring the materials for Cabarets of Death, he and I developed a stage show. He wanted me to score, do a live score for his lecture, where he would project some of these images and talk about it. And he was compiling, so we had just kind of started compiling these things. So we did a couple of these performances in San Francisco, and then we went to Los Angeles at the Los Angeles Death Salon, and then at the Steve Allen Theater. And so I know that Mel would be so happy to know that this finally took book form, and is out in the world. And I know that he's joining us today. And as someone said earlier, I think he would love this so much that after his death, the book comes out and we're talking about him in the very, you know, Grand Guignol fashion. He would love all of this. But I worked with Mel with some other live scores. And the thing about Mel is he would call you usually at night and he'd say, I got some footage. I got some footage for us. And he wanted me to create original music to perform, and he would lecture about it. And but the thing that was crazy is, where was he getting this stuff? And he would always say, oh, you know, I just got back from the vaults. It was always, I got back from the vaults. And it's like, well, where are these vaults? I would love to go to these vaults. And he would come back with the most bizarre, creepy, but beautiful imagery. And one of my favorite events that I created with him was for the Hanussen, Hitler's Jewish clairvoyant. He sent me this footage that he had found in the vaults, and it was so bizarre and just unbelievable, this grainy black and white footage. And here is Hanussen hypnotizing little children and elderly people, and they're being hypnotized to move like animals and make strange faces and move in these contorted ways. And then later learned that Hitler, a lot of his theatrics and body movement and language was influenced by Hanussen, and so I created a live score to this creepy footage, and Mel and I talked a lot about because all of these pieces were short, that we would love to do a whole evening of the live music with these different pieces, and of course that didn't happen, but it was such a joy to do those events. And if you buy Cabarets of Death today, you should pick up that Hanussen book, because that's a really, really, really interesting, fascinating time in history. And that was the thing, is like Mel was interested in these very obscure, taboo, really off the radar subjects. And when I first met Mel, I met him through Russell Blackwood. And this was, you know, the great thing about this is this was all in the early 2000s, maybe even late 1990s, but the cusp of 2000s. And so it was before social media, it was before the smartphone. So when you met someone that was into all this obscure stuff like you, there was a really intense feeling of a kindred spirit, because it was hard to find out any information about these type of subjects. And so when you met someone that was also interested, it was really a profound bond. And so I had been working with Eddie Muller, who with the film noir festivals, and he's now on TCM, and he introduced me to Russell. And what was this, like maybe 2000, 1999 or something? And they were fans of my music. And then Russell says to me, and this was like sort of this whole backwards way of meeting Mel. Russell says to me, I have a friend, I want to introduce you to my friend Mel Gordon, and he's a teacher at UC Berkeley. Well, I didn't know anything about Mel Gordon. He's like, he really likes your music and he likes your aesthetic, and we'd like you to meet him. And so Russ takes me to Mel's house. You remember this, Russ?
Oh, yes.
So I didn't know about his books or anything. And, you know, this was a long time ago. I was a wee gal. And so I was taken to Mel Gordon's home. And like I said before, this was before smartphones, before anything. So you can imagine me walking into Mel Gordon's home and looking around and feeling like, wow, this is my people, you know, like this is where I'm meant to be. And Mel and I had this amazing conversation, and he was just showing me all of these archives and photographs. And he started talking about the Grand Guignol, and he started talking to me about Polymaxa. Well, at the time, I didn't know about Polymaxa. I had heard a little bit about Grand Guignol, and it was fascinating. And of course, Russ and I bonded. We became fast friends because of our love of old horror. And so Mel starts pulling out these old articles about Polymaxa, and we can show the first slide, Peter. So this is Polymaxa, and this is the one or one of very few interviews with her. And so Mel Xeroxed this and handed it to me, this stapled article, and he says, I want you to read this, and I would like you to create the famous roles that Maxa played in the Grand Guignol. So I read this article, and I think, Russell, you told me that this article is included in the new edition of his
That's right.
Grand Guignol book. Great, because it's a fascinating article. She was supposedly, put to death over 30,000 times on the stage in this variety of, horrific ways. And she became mad. She became quite addicted to the life and craved that. And there's at the end of the article, she says something they have tried to kill me many times, and one day death will come for real, and death will be my final and greatest love affair. And I always love that. But I tell you, once you've been killed on stage and you're screaming and you're going through all of this violent stuff, it is, I can see it is very addicting. It's like this great primal therapy to just scream on stage. So Mel had this idea, we want to recreate Max's famous roles, and we want you to play, and let's move to the next slide. So we did. And so Russell and I founded the Hypnodrome with Eddie Muller, and Mel was sort of our, under his historical tutelage. And this was the Welcome to the Hypnodrome 2004 opening poster, and I love this poster, and you can see like how it's like unspeakable terror, carnival freaks, forbidden flesh, twisted sex, mesmerism, bloodlust, featuring Jill Tracy. Fun for the whole family. And the Hypnodrome was done with Mel's orchestration, very historical, and Russ was talking a little bit about it earlier, but part of the Hypnodrome was this lights out spook show, and they made they purposely sealed it off so that no light could get through, and you would sit in the dark and your eyes would never adjust to the blackness. And it was in the Hypnodrome that I really learned, at any age, even as an adult, it's frightening when you're sitting in the pitch dark and your eyes never adjust and you don't know what's going to happen. And it was crafted very much like the original Grand Guignol, where there were secret panels and passageways for the crew to get behind the seats, so then they could touch the audience in the dark or tickle them with a feather, and things would just start happening that they weren't aware of. And this was all done, through Mel's guidance. And so let's move on to the next slide. So this is me recreating Max's role in The Beast from 1928. And I am a deranged countess who is being devoured by a wild wolf boy, who of course is my long lost son. And so as I'm being eaten alive, I'm just so happy to be reunited with my son. So it is a violent but happy death, as I'm saying there, Rudolph, I'm so happy to be back with you. And we can go to the next slide. So this is from Murder of the Will, 1925. I'm being hypnotized by a madman. And this was adapted from an original Grand Guignol play by Eddie Muller for me at the Hypnodrome. And so after I'm hypnotized, I'm killed in a violent train crash. But then, of course, I come back to seek my revenge. And I climb behind the Hypnodrome where people can't see me. And I'm speaking through these tubing, this long plastic tubing that gave the illusion of the audience couldn't tell where the voice was coming from, because I was, now in the spirit world. So that's how that play ended and what we did. And it was just so amazing, because there were the Hypnodrome was rigged in all these different ways to do these crazy effects. And let's go to the next slide. And this is a torture of Cavaradossi. And I chose this one today because that's Russ being bound and gagged in the background as he's being tortured by beautiful women while I'm singing Tosca. And and this play had one of my favorite lines where Rush, you can refresh my memory. It was a brothel, and I was the madam, and I created these extravagant scenes for whatever the client wanted. And you came into the brothel, and it was something with barnyard animals or something. And then I remember you came in and you said, "Oh, I remember something about the lusty memories." And I said, "Oh yes, the room still smells faintly of goat." That was one of my favorite lines from any of those plays. But in this play, I had to then, singing Tosca, jump off a balcony to my death, and there were hidden pillows underneath, so I would dramatically fall, but then make sure that I wasn't hurting myself because there were hidden cushions. And so we'll go to the next slide. So this was an event I did with Mel and Russ. This was one of our earlier events, but this poster taken from some old Grand Guignol imagery, it's so Mel because you can read, it's called Breaking the Shackles, de Sade, Grand Guignol and the French Body, an evening of unfettered live acts with explanations and refreshments to follow. So it was so Mel that we were showing these deviant sex and this horrible violent acts, and then we'd have cupcakes and punch and cookies. But that's what I loved about Mel, is he was very unassuming. He was a very quiet spoken man, almost in this sort of soft monotone voice. He wasn't trying to shock you. He was just a genuine man that was really interested in these things. It wasn't an affectation. He wasn't trying to get attention. He was just a very sincere person, and that's very rare today, as Joanna was saying earlier, of someone that's into these very deviant topics, but it's in a genuine way. He's not trying to ruffle feathers or get attention from it. It's just what he is interested in. And he was the kind of guy that you would sit down next to at the bar, and he would just look so unassuming, and then you would start talking with him, and he would have these outrageous topics and things to talk about. It was fascinating to know him. I am so blessed to have had the years of doing these projects with him. And I am so happy that his writing, his explorations, his legacy is living on with all of you and his books. I'm glad to have had a small part in it. So thanks for having me join you today.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was lovely. And boy, it just really brought back a lot of memories, man. I mean, the Hypnodrome, all of that. And of course, Thrill Peddlers. It's just still in our memory. It's burnt into our memories. So we're coming up now towards the end. Last but not least, our final guest tonight is Christina Ward. Christina is the author, is an editor, is a publisher. She's also vice president and editor of Feral House, which published numerous books by Mel. Christina, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to everybody today. And what I wanted to talk about is a little bit about the relationship between Mel Gordon and Feral House. And of course, Feral House was run by and founded by Adam Parfrey. Adam sadly died a few months after Mel did in the spring of 2018. A lot of folks think about Feral House and think about Mel's books and wonder, how did that get started? And so I thought I'd share a little bit about Adam and Mel. One of Adam's first jobs was in New York City as an assistant editor to the Performance Arts Journal. Adam had a great interest in live theater. As many of you may know, his father was a very successful character actor in Los Angeles. And then, of course, his mother, a director, who in New York City, who had studied in avant-garde. So Adam's interest was there. In college, he went to college for just a few years before deciding it wasn't for him. He actually directed a very forward-thinking production of Jerry's Ubu Roy. And so there was an interest already, and Adam was aware of Mel and Mel's work. Adam also lived in San Francisco for a while, and their paths had crossed, the interests were there. So when Mel was interested in getting some of the work out, especially Voluptuous Panic, which is the first book that Mel wrote for Feral House. I phrase it that way on purpose. Mel had a fascinating research style, which many of you have kind of remarked on, and I'll speak a little bit more to that. Mel was a magpie, a collector of things, a magical thing finder, as many of you mentioned, that he could find things that no one else could. As someone who works similarly in writing about history, I find Mel inspiring personally, as well as my research style is similar. Adams was as well. So there was always a group of us who were kind of working outside academia, who understand that reading these primary sources and synthesizing them and putting them in the context and presenting them in that larger frame of how should you look at this? Well, you should look at it however you want to look at it, but let us present you all of this great material to look at. So in our first book with Mel, which was Voluptuous Panic, the first edition being published in 2000, an expanded edition was published in 2008. It really set the tone for the rest of the work that we published for Mel, and that is, of course, a collaboration. Horizontal collaboration, which came out in 2016. But before that, in between, Mel worked, as folks mentioned, to bring out Funny Man, which was the history of the Siegel and Schuster's, the first Jewish superhero, a comic, which was the precursor of Superman. And of course, the Honuson book, the biography of Anita Berber. We are quite pleased to keep and work with Mel's estate to continue to keep these books in print, especially the first two editions, meaning there was one very early in the late 90s, and then later, again in, I think, 2017, of the Grand Guignol, which we translated to The Theater of Fear and Blood, because we wanted to make sure that these titles were accessible to people, that they could get this material, they could read about it. Mel did talk to us about publishing Cabarets of Death, and at that time, it wasn't in a form or function of a book quite yet. And so we're so happy that Joanna and Mark Pilkington at Strange Attractor was able to work with Mel's estate, with Maer, to get the material into such a shape to publish this book, which as you can see, I have a copy that I happily purchased, and I encourage everyone to do so to keep these projects alive and to keep Mel's work alive. I mentioned in working singularly, Mel, as many folks have talked about, are long phone calls with Mel, conversations with Mel. And his type of brain was a synthesizer. He was reading these primary materials and then thinking about these connections and how things fit into both its time and place, and then how that would be of interest to people today. And the way he worked that out was through those conversations via the phone and via in person. He loved to meet people and just talk your ear off, because what he was doing is essentially externally processing. He was writing his books as he was talking to you. He was also taking on board some of people's reactions and maybe some of the feedback a little bit, not in a critique way, but how people reacted to the material when Mel was presenting it and talking about it. And out of those great conversations and out of those archives, out of that research came those books. And then for him working with Adam, Adam Parfrey, if you did not know him, had a reputation of being a bit of a irascible curmudgeon. And that came out with Mel's relationship with Adam, in so much that Mel would talk to us and talk to Adam about this great idea for a book, Mel's next book. And Mel would start that research. He'd already been working on it, but he would save the writing portion to the last possible moment and until Adam kindly yet firmly threatened Mel to actually write the GD book. And so that was often the process. This was referenced a little earlier, and that it feels actually good, Peter, to kind of come to the end of it. I'm hoping I'm not telling tales out of school, but since Mel's passing, we know that there were other books that Mel was working on. He talked about it, and someone referenced it. It wasn't actually California love cults. Mel was referred to it as fascist love
That's
cults.
right, which is even better.
So, and it was something I just was reviewing before talking to everyone today a little bit in Mel's obituary for the New York Times. Adam is quoted as saying, yeah, Mel was working on fascist love cults for us and had been working on it for years. So as a culmination through Joanna's work in preserving and putting out Mel's work, through Maer's work in preserving all of the raw materials that Mel had collected, and that Mel's archive is there. And I'm happy to say that we are working with Mel Gordon's estate to bring these books back and finish them and bring them to readers. And one of the first projects we are working on is I'll be working on with Mel's actual research materials, finishing fascist love cults.
Great.
So let's look for that and hope for that in a couple of years. Hopefully, I won't be as slow as Mel was, because Mel did all the heavy lifting. And so he's left just an extraordinary body of work of research, his notes, as well as, of course, all of the raw material. My last book, which was called Holy Food, which was about the intersection of cults and food. So I'm actually working on some knowledge that I have from my own research and pairing that with Mel's. We're also working on bringing back some of Mel's other writing in collections, because I think for us at Feral House, Mel's work is so important to all of us weirdos in the world. Mel became kind of almost a godfather, as everyone has kind of recalled these conversations and Mel's generous nature of sharing of himself and of his research, because I think that he realized, and this is my opinion, that he had a rare interest in these things and was always excited when other folks did and wanted to bring you into his kind of personal circle, into that family, because he knew that all of us weirdos are rare beasts and that we need his nurturing. And I miss him for that. And I'm so glad that we have Mel's books and have his archives and have his research, so folks can go to Austin to the Harry Ransom Center and you can look at Mel's research. There are so many worlds that Mel was exploring, and there are so many potential books in Mel's research. And I welcome and I challenge people to go to Mel's archives, to the, and I not remember the exact name, but in the Yiddish museum are all of the archives on Mel's research on Jewish and Yiddish theater, as well as other and Jewish humor. Mel had so many varied interests, and I would love to see more books be created from his archives. That said, let's celebrate what we do have, and that is Joanna's and Mark Pilkington's and Maer's incredible work on cabarets of death and bringing that to people. And of course, wherever you're watching this right now, you can order it online at City Lights Books, and they will ship it to you anywhere in the world. You can order it from the Morbid Anatomy Museum, only because they have a couple deluxe extras that you may be interested. You could order 2 copies, one from Morbid Anatomy and one from City Lights, and give it as a gift. You can tell I'm working publishing because I want everyone to buy books. Mel Gordon was a rare figure. His life is worth remembering and celebrating. And again, I can't think of a better way than sharing some of the memories of the people he's influenced and helped, as well as his work. And we've all talked a lot, and so I will leave it at that. And just with a thank you for everybody, and thank you everyone for keeping Mel's work alive in our memories, because his memory is a blessing. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Christina. That was lovely. And thank you for displaying all of Mel's books behind you, which of course, City Lights, you know, we carry a full selection. We posted links in the chat, so people please keep an eye on that. This is a very lovely, lovely edition, by the way. And so pick one up. I'd like to open it up now for a little bit of discussion amongst us all. Try to unmute each and every one of us here so that we can let's see. I think we're all pretty much unmuted. So, you know, you bring up something very interesting, Christina, about people visiting Austin. And maybe we can start the conversation there for anyone in the audience that's a student that's fascinated by this work. Adi, maybe you too, and Jim could also, you know, speak to this. Is what's the right approach? I mean, how do you go into these papers? I mean, and yes.
I'm raising my hand because as a historic researcher, I'm happy to do this and to talk about this. The Harry Ransom Center is a wonderful, beautiful place. And here's a secret, and and you wouldn't believe it's in Texas. They have actually a tremendous holding of what could be termed dirty books. And so it's something, if you're not a student, as a researcher, I would suggest email them ahead of time and set an appointment up. And so and talk to them about what material you're interested in seeing, and they'll reserve a room for you. You're not allowed to take any material home. This is not that kind of library. You can't check it out, but they will help you and allow you to say, make photocopies of specific information. Some things are restricted based on the delicacy of the material, and then how the donor, that would be Mel's estate, how they termed how they wanted that material used. So it's not something that you should just randomly show up in Austin and go to the library and do, but do a little work. And depending on your interest, approach it as Mel would, which is with the open beginner's mind. Lose all your preconceived notions and just spend time with the material and absorb it, read it, and see what it tells you. How would you synthesize it? What is it showing you? And that is, I think, the ideal way to approach Mel's research.
Very nice. Thank you. Anybody else?
I just want to say how much I love what Christina just said, and I hope people really will. I think it's such a great provocation, and also just so delighted to hear you guys are going to be doing fascist love cults. I'm so delighted.
Anyone have any thoughts, any reflections after all of that? That's we get so many sides of Mel here, and you know, my mind is reeling. Anyone?
Well, I can think of two books that could just be done probably from his research. I mean, one is, as I mentioned, you know, this oral history of the Artef. I mean, as I recall, it's just there. He had his students did these interviews. They were transcribed. I mean, all that needs to be done is for somebody to write an introduction, organize the material, and there you have it. And I'm familiar with the literature that's come out on the Artef, and amazingly, it doesn't draw on what he had. I mean, so there's that. The other thing is that he was very fond of this other Weimar, Diva Valeska Goethe, and almost completely unknown here. Although if you go to the Modern Museum in Berlin, the first thing you see is a whole room devoted to her. I mean, this is one of these things I remember Mel telling me about her, and I'm going, what? You know what I mean? And so he put together a PowerPoint, but this is based on all this material that he, you know, had assimilated. I mean, you know, it seems to me that you know, a book on her could be done that would be comparable to his wonderful book on Anita Berber. I mean, it's just there. I think that he probably did all the work. and that, you know, there wasn't time. I mean, Christina, I was fascinated by what you said, and I'm very glad that you went last. And I felt bad because I had wanted to put in a plug for Farrell, you know, in terms of you know, getting his books out there, because as you probably know, he had a hell of a time getting published. I mean,
Yeah.
which is one of the most outrageous, and then, you know, you had to put up with it with a total paucity of reviews. You know, as far as I know, the only book of his that ever got a serious review was the Grand Guignol.
Yeah. I'll speak to that. Yeah, that is correct. And it was the first edition of the Grand Guignol did get some notice and some review. But if you're familiar with Feral House and if you're familiar with Adam, Adam was loyal and Adam had vision. And we like to think that we continue his vision as well as add our own and add to it. And let me put that just that asterisk little there. If anyone actually goes to the archives to write about the Yiddish theater things and the Jewish humor, the origins of, and goes to the Harry Ransom Center and looks there, talk to me. We're easy to find. Feral House would be very interested if someone is working with Mel's archive and with this state. We can't write them all. So there's my challenge to anyone watching out there.
Could I add something, Peter?
Yes, please.
All right. There's something about Mel's generosity that was mentioned before with his research. I don't know if you're aware, I was just reminded by Jim mentioning Valeska Gert that there is a TDR article about Valeska Gert written by his then girlfriend and now very famous Flemish choreographer, Anne-Theresa de Kirkmaker. And she at the time was my student when I was teaching assistant for Richard Schechner in his performance theory class, and Mel's living girlfriend. And Mel just told her, you need to write a paper. You love Valeska Gert. Here is all the research, right? And she wrote it, and it's a beautiful article. And in Berlin today, there is a Valeska Gert award for outstanding choreographers. And I'm sure that the more material is probably in his estate or in the Ransom Center in Austin. And it's a great idea because more people are aware of Valeska Gert's amazing contribution to her period in the performing arts, but also to later choreographers and the grotesque especially. So that's one thing. The other thing is no one mentioned, because it's not directly related to the subject of this particular book, but Mel was also the author of 2 operas. He wrote the librettos of 2 operas and worked with the composer Bruce Adolph. One was Michoel's The Wise, and that could be a subject for another book, yet another book, because his research on Solomon Michoels, the great Yiddish actor, who went as in Stalin sent him to the United States to raise money for the war effort, the Russian war effort, before the United States joined the Second World War. And then, of course, he was assassinated in a very cruel way by Stalin's people. Michoels was a great, Mel has a footage of Michoels' final scene in King Lear in Yiddish, singing a lullaby to Cordelia. It's the most amazing Lear scene I've ever watched in a lecture by Mel. And of course, Mel's enthusiasm for this brought everybody, you know, to share it. It was an amazing experience, both privately when he showed it to me and then in a public lecture. So that is, I think, a great great potential for another book. The second opera that I know less about is Shabtai Tzvi, about the false Messiah.
Oh,
That was also an interesting opera, but I don't know much about the research, but I trust, knowing Mel well, that there's a lot of good material there too.
well, he performed the Mechoil's opera at the 92nd Street Y.
Right.
One or two
I was
performances.
there for two dress rehearsals and the first performance. It was very interesting.
He
It
told me
was
that.
also about the attempt to create a Jewish autonomy or republic in Birobidzhan.
Birobidzhan,
You know, people in Birobidzhan, non-Jews, still speak Yiddish today. Very interesting.
Yeah, but he told me that he went to the toilet afterwards and he heard these people talking. They said, his parents must have been communists.
Jeffrey asks here on the chat, what would Mel have put into a fourth edition of his Grand Guignol book? Because the two that he did for Amok had different plays swapped out. And then, of course, the Feral House one was even further revised. And I think he probably would have turned people on to the fact that Mondo Connie 2 has George Saunders narrating the final performance at the Grand Guignol, and there's actual footage of a woman's arm being cut off and the gasping spectators. I was surprised, though, to hear from Mel that Amok approached him about writing the Grand Guignol book, and that he didn't have a great deal of interest in it, but it was a good job, and he asked for a summer in Paris, expenses for that out of it. So we went to Paris and collected all these things, did all these interviews, and of course, came back to New York and had to write the book. And it was helpful to hear from him that sometimes writers and directors both really need the gun put to their head in order to just get on and do it, as opposed to planning it. I found that very freeing.
So I'm going to just jump in just with a quick comment to kind of make sure the through line there is Adam Parfrey, before starting Feral House, started Amok Press with Ken Swayze. And it was Adam that approached, that's how he approached Mel.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And then so Adam approached Mel, and then Adam happened to get like a teeny tiny, like a couple $1,000 from as an inheritance from his grandmother. And that was the money that is used to send Mel to some of that to Paris to do that research for that first one. And I just wanted to sell more books for a second. If anyone is a mystery fan, the great Scottish mystery writer Philip Kerr, who again sadly died a few years ago, has a whole series on that is set in beginning the first 3 books in the Weimar era. And I had the great pleasure of knowing Mr. Kerr a little bit, and spoke to him and asked him whether he was influenced by Mel at all. And he cautiously and said absolutely yes. And that Mel, and especially in Voluptuous Panic, and Mel's work on Anita Berber definitely influenced the books that were set in that time. So if anybody's really interested, if you love Babylon, Berlin, you definitely want to go read Philip Kerr, and you'll see how Mel's influenced other writers.
So Russell, I want to throw something out at you for those younger folks to maybe pick up a copy of Mel's Grand Guignol book and want to go out there and do something. You've had many, many moons of experience in putting such things together. What advice would you give to like an upcoming younger generation that maybe want to like create their own house?
To use more blood than you imagine the costumer and actor will be happy with. I think that lighting and sound design are design elements that shouldn't be underestimated. Mel broke the news to me probably 5 years into my journey with Grand Guignol that many of the Grand Guignol plays aren't all that interesting. Part of it is that these plays were very topical, and they were coming out of the naturalism movement. So it was their accessibility and immediacy that made them exciting terror plays. And then a lot of the comedies seem kind of dusty by today's standards. So if you find a really a Grand Guignol play that you're genuinely excited about, maybe that's the one to do. Don't think you're going to keep looking and looking and looking and looking. Now more than ever, you can lay your hands on English translations of scripts, like direct translations. There are 30 that are available in Richard Hand and Michael Wilson's first 3 books. And then their 4th book in the series is about contemporary horror theater companies. And there are another, I believe, like 20 plays, of which Thrill Peddlers has Eddie Muller's adaptation of An Orgy in the Lighthouse in it. So there's material out there in English now. And so maybe you would even say, oh, consider doing something that's maybe written more more recently, rather than going straight for a play from the 19-teens that actually played the Grand Guignol.
I recall a really great conversation Mel and I had about William Castle and the filmmaker, and all the little gimmicks and Mel would say, like, you can never have enough gimmicks.
Well, and William Castle was a great inspirer for the shock boxes. Of course, all the rigging that we did in those really came out of Percepto and the Tingler.
Yeah. Anyone else? Well, we're coming up to the end of our little journey here, and we thought it would be really, really nice to end with Mel himself. So I am going to prepare our media here.
And while you're preparing, I can just say this was my friend Ronnie Thomas was the filmmaker in residence at the Morbid Anatomy Museum, and he did a short with Mel Gordon about Grand Guignol. And when we did the first release party for this book, he went back to the original material, recut this specifically to celebrate Mel after the fact. So, and I think it does have a scene that you were talking about from Mono Kane as well, Russell, with the arm being cut off. So with that, I'll just.
I'm Mel Gordon. I'm the author of a book that came out in several editions called The Grand Guignol. It's the story of a theater of terror and horror in Paris. The Grand Guignol is a very slight, small, extraordinary path into theater history of a kind of tourist attraction, a kind of extraordinary sensationalist theater that wound up having enormous effects in the 20th century. That horror and slasher movies and even German expressionism was greatly affected by the Grand Guignol. And the Grand Guignol became one of the biggest tourist attractions in Paris. And, there's so many funny things about it. One is the people who are attracted to it, other than tourists, are people living in Paris. Ho Chi Minh, who's a Chinese pastry chef, went to the Grand Guignol once a month. And the King of Romania and his mistress, Ada Lupescu, had their own bedroom in the back of the Grand Guignol where they made love while they watched it. And the folklore of the Grand Guignol is extraordinary. The people, it's a theater of horror and terror, but the actors actually suffered horror and terror, sometimes more than the audiences. That many of them were injured in the productions. Of 2 of them died. Some of the playwrights outside the theater who wrote about death died on opening night. So it has this extensive folklore. One of the interesting things about the Grand Guignol is it started as a chapel. And when you look at it, it has this otherworldly presence. And the productions generally ran according to an idea of what they called hot and cold showers, sex farces interspersed with horrific plays, with comedies, and then horrific plays yet again. On the average evening, 2 people would faint, sometimes as many as 15. And the people who faint are almost always males, which is interesting. We'll see some images of that. Because it said that males didn't cover their eyes when they saw the horrific effects. And the effects were pretty astounding, of people being mutilated, of eyes being gouged out, of blood flowing from the heart, from the head, legs being cut off, of people being gobbled by pumas and lions and serial murderers. So part of it is there's a kind of humor inside the Grand Guignol, but also kind of devotion to seeing what could happen when ordinary people go crazy. And one aspect of the Grand Guignol that fascinated me, that its premise was that any one of us, under the right circumstances, can do the most outlandish and grotesque things. And so this shows up within the Grand Guignol in play after play, how the most innocent, normal person can become mad and crazy under certain circumstances. And that's what the Grand Guignol investigates. What are the certain circumstances? The other thing that's odd about the Grand Guignol is that who is attracted to it? During World War I, badly wounded French soldiers were brought to the Grand Guignol as a morale booster. And by the 1930s, the owners of the Grand Guignol and the leading directors are all female, including the head of the Feminist Association. So although the Grand Guignol had rapes and brutalities and domestic violence, that it encouraged women who had no other outlets in Parisian theater to work in this particular place. It's more than almost any other theater, even more than the music halls. The Grand Guignol produced this grand folklore, which ended in 1962 because it became something of a joke. It couldn't really compete with horror movies when exactly the most bloody and psychologically stressful horror movies really get their start with the Grand Guignol. And even Grand Guignol actors go to Hollywood where they reenact some of the same characterizations that they invented in this little Parisian theater. I became involved with writing about the Grand Guignol. I'm interested in the extraordinary in theater and in urban culture and popular entertainment. That I had written about in an article a list of theaters that weren't properly documented, and one was Grand Guignol. And a publishing house, a very small one, contacted me and asked me if I knew anyone who could write the history of Grand Guignol, the theater of horror and terror and brutal effects. And I asked around, I couldn't find anyone. I said I would be willing to do it if they could send me to Paris. So they sent me to Paris, and then I became very depressed after doing the research. I was thinking, how could I write a whole book about this very odd and curious theater? And finally, I realized that this was the purest theater on earth. It's about what happens when you break taboos, sexual taboos, and taboos related to death and violence and social restraint. And suddenly I convinced myself and then other people that, in fact, instead of being a minor tourist attraction, this was the essential theater that it spoke right to the spectator and got to the core of what entertainment is about, is the exploration of taboo. And sure enough, that the book itself began to flow quite easily and with a lot of amusement. The other thing that I thought about is what makes the Grand Guignol work is a kind of black humor that hadn't been written about. I had interviewed actors and directors from the Grand Guignol about 15 years after they left it. And they all were so funny, and many of them worked in the restaurant trade. So there they were chopping up steak tartare, talking about their bloody and ghoulish exploitation of topics in the Grand Guignol. And they laughed about it, and I laughed with them, and I realized this was the secret of this theater. And what not only the actors and directors and playwrights had, but the audience picked up on it. There's something ghoulish and terrifying that's concealed around a core of humor, that we're all going to die, that we're probably not going to die the way we expected to. And the Grand Guignol reveals this. The book I wrote, which came out 25 years ago, inspired quite a number of productions of the Grand Guignol. There hadn't been a modern book on the Grand Guignol in several generations. And people, especially young people, had picked up on it because it had something, some core idea of what entertainment is about. It's about pure sex and pure violence. And the idea that seeing fingers sliced off in a realistic way or eyes gouged out has something appealing, especially when it's done directly and done with not the normal kind of ironic or campy way, but as pure entertainment. That there's something in the twisted human heart that loves to see this. And oddly enough, one of the reasons I wrote the book at the time, 25 years ago, that censorship in entertainment, especially in movies and television, was a very hot topic. And the notion that violent movies lead to violent behavior in the spectators seemed to me a very naive supposition, that every culture has a different way of dealing with violent entertainments. And in France, the center of the Grand Guignol, that it was one of the most peaceful places on earth, especially in the 20s and 30s. Even though they had the guillotine, even though there was street crime, there was less of it in France than in almost any other place. And it was the least militaristic of societies. And when the Nazis came to Paris in 1940, one of the first things the Gestapo wanted to do was to ban the Grand Guignol. So I thought this was all deliciously ironic and a good exploration of how complicated the notions of vile or nasty or outrageous entertainment produces bad effects, bad social effects in audiences. That in some audiences they do, but in others they don't.
I have to say that just listening to Mel talk reminds me of what it's like to have a conversation with him where you want to weigh in, you have to ask him about this and about that, and it really develops. I mean, it wasn't like listening to a lecture, you know, there was a lot of, you know, give and take. I mean, I loved it.
Well, thank you all so very, very much for joining us today. I mean, it was such an honor, I mean, to have so many of you. And for those of you in the audience as well, thank you for joining us from all over and for completing the circle. As always, we have posted links with which you may purchase books in the chat. Of course, if you're in the neighborhood, come on down, visit City Lights. We are one of the great browsing experiences of all time. We are located in San Francisco's North Beach District, open from 10 a.m. till 10 p.m. every evening. Hope to see you all very, very soon. Once again, so grateful, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Peter, for hosting this. Thanks so much to all of you for joining.